just another minute before starting. In the meantime, I just wanted to say, thank you, pun intended, to both Stanton Street Shul. And also tonight's class is in honor of the memory of Yitzhak Ben Bono. So we hope it will be meaningful to his memory and to his family. So
thank you.
Okay, we'll give it about one more minute, and then I don't want to penalize the good people for a long time. Also, an easy housekeeping, please feel free to use at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, if not your voice, when you have questions or comments, and I will try to scan and be on the list.
Okay.
Margie, I know we'll do that, and I'm inviting the rest of you. Okay, so I think we'll get started. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know if everyone can see it, or rather, if anyone can't see it, please pipe up. But I'm assuming it's good. Margie, Eliezer, everything's clear?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. So I'm gonna dive right in. We're here to talk about gratitude. It's certainly something that we know about, we think we know about, we spend time thinking about and talking about, but I think the way we're going to discuss things tonight will add some depth that I hope will be meaningful to all. So, what better way to start than with the way religious Jews, spiritual Jews, not naming Jews, but built into our Siddur, and even sooner than we get up and actually pick up a Siddur, the first words out of our mouth each day, famously, is the tefillah that I have in front of us. I'll just read it quickly, right? Modeh ani lefanecha melachai v'kayam shechazarta bi nishvati b'chamla rabba emunatecha. We are thanking God for waking up. And so the first words that we're saying are words of gratitude. And here's where I think if you haven't heard this before, you're going to be blown away, as my father, who's here, likes to say. I hope you're sitting down, which I know in the Zoom people tend to do, right? But we have a basic question. As familiar as these words are, there's something odd grammatically. We say modeh ani, whereas if you do Hebrew lessons, what do you ask your kids? You're practicing tenses. If you're going to say, for example, I write, he writes, she writes, you'll say ani kotev, he kotevet, hu kotev, etc. And we should say ani modeh. Why are we saying, whoever has the sound in the background, if you could mute, please. Let me just see. I may be able to mute all. One moment. I have that choice. I am not seeing it. Apologies. Let me just stop here for a second and try to mute all. It seems like it solved itself, although for some reason what I normally see as an option is not working. So I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. So right here's this tefillah we're very familiar with. We say it every day. It's the first words we say. It's a tefillah of gratitude. It's beautiful, and yet there seems to be a fundamental question. We say modeh ani, whereas grammatically we should be saying ani modeh, right? What's another famous tefillah song? Ani ma'amin, I believe. The word I seems like it should come first. And of course, the question is itself the answer. Why? Because when we're talking especially about a tefillah of gratitude, it would be misplaced if the first words out of our mouth are I, right? For us to live a life of gratitude, the first thought that I want to share is we live a life of gratitude by not focusing on ourselves, by being outward directed, by appreciating other people, and of course here God and what they have done for us. And that's the reason why it ain't no mistake, right? Moda ani, not ani modeh. Now, that's one famous launching point for us to talk about gratitude. And of course, another, which I'm sure everyone, if not almost everyone, if not everyone on this call has heard, is the justifiably famous idea that we are Jews are Yehudim, named after Judah, Leah's son, Jacob's son. And we have the word modeh, and there we have the word odeh. I put the verse and the pasuk right here, Vatahar od vateled ben, vatomer hapam, what's she gonna do this time? Odeh et Hashem, I will give thanks, I will acknowledge God, therefore she called his name Yehudah. So of course, pretty fundamental, first words out of our mouth, our self-definition, our very name relates to gratitude. And yet what I want to share is, as with Moda Ani, where perhaps things are not as simple, or we could go further than what you may already know, there's something fascinating if we take a step back and we think about Yehudah and think about not so much in the Tanakh, but since, what else do we know about Yehudah? What is our personal connection to Yehudah? And of course, there are 10 lost tribes. And if you're not a Levite these days, the answer to the question that I just posed is we tend to say that we all come from either the tribe or certainly the kingdom of Judah, of Yehudah. And so if we put those two concepts together, perhaps homiletically and perhaps even fundamentally and not just a cute drush, right? What we're really saying is that here is this man, here is this tribe, here are these people associated with gratitude, and those associated with gratitude are the ones who live, are the ones who survive. It's no coincidence. Yes, Eliezer.
No, you can finish your sentence.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, it's no coincidence. That would be the thought that not only are we identified as Yehudim, but to the extent that we most likely come from the tribe of Yehudah, then what you're saying is that gratitude, thankfulness, which is so much a part of the character of the man of the tribe, this leads to survival. This is a secret of survival. And then after taking your question, I'm going to give some interesting sort of studies and thoughts that tie that together and then go back to Moda Ani. But please feel free, Eliezer.
Okay, not so much as a question, but two little points. First of all, it's interesting the translation there translates it as praise. I guess the word odeh or modim is a very flexible word that's used slightly differently in different places, because I don't know whose translation this is, but there it says praise, which is not the way we would normally translate it. The other point I wanted to make is just in line with your comment about modeh ani lefanecha, you have modim anachnu, same question, same answer.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And I think not that my expertise is translation. As you see, it's funny, from the Siddur above, it was thanks. On the bottom on the pasuk, as you said, it was praise, which may be less likely. I personally feel that the key to modim, certainly in context there, and probably modani, it's about everyday miracles. And therefore, I feel the root of modeh is to acknowledge and to admit something that wouldn't be obvious, right? If you see a glorious miracle, it's obvious, but what we're saying in our modani, what we were saying on modim anachnu is right? Daily miracles, et cetera, et cetera. So great point. The words matter, and I think that's key to what we're doing, right? Because gratitude for the big things, that's super easy, and let's bring it back down to our lives and to what most of us experience. So I was mentioning the secret to survival, and if you don't know it, I will share, not the secret to survival. Of course, that's something we're all working on, but I wanted to share two great stories to two great studies. And the first is a story that came out in the early 2000s, and it involved nuns. If anyone, feel free to chime in if you've heard of it. It's called the Nun Study, understandably. But what was remarkable was twofold. Essentially, you had a group of 700 American nuns. And when they entered the convent, the Mother Superior asked them to write letters saying why they were joining, right? So as young women in their 20s, they wrote these letters that gave an indication of their aspirations, but also their state of mind. Like anyone on this call, right? You're going to have some people who are more naturally upbeat, some people who are less so. All of them were clearly spiritually motivated, but you had this cross section. So they do this when they're in their 20s. There are 700 of them. And what else do we know? Right? They're leading fairly similar lives. So when you talk about studies, that is sort of, you know, the amazing option that you would love. If you get people who are eating similarly, you know, doing the same amount or lack of amount of exercise, and you also have quantity. So you had these 700 nuns who wrote letters in their 20s, and now they were anywhere between 75 and 100 and something years old. So what they did, the researchers, is they went back and they looked at those letters, right? And they tried to analyze those letters. Of course, there could be elements of subjectivity, but they wanted to see who was a thankful, grateful person, right? Who had some of these character traits that we would associate with gratitude versus who was a wonderful person who just, you know, that wasn't their style. Either way, they were dedicating their life, you know, to be a nun. And the results were startling. What they found is that the more positive emotions that were in those original letters, emotions like contentment, gratitude, happiness, then the more likely they were able to literally live longer, as much as 6 or 7 years. And this helped launch so much of what we know today in studies and people recognizing the health benefits of gratitude. So if we jump back to the starting point, and I was saying somewhat fancifully or not fancifully that we are from Judah, and Judah is that tribe whose mission statement, right, whose identity is tied into gratitude. Well, just know it's not so crazy. We had this study of 700 nuns, which showed us that the key or a key to physical longevity could be gratitude. And that's on the physical side. And then a little more recently, there was a study on the emotional, psychological side. They took, it was at Indiana University, as I mentioned on the sheet. There were about 300 students who were going to, you know, the counseling center, mental health on campus. And with their permission, all of them, of course, got therapy, right? They didn't want to risk not treating anyone, but they were divided randomly into groups of 3. And one group was told to do nothing, right? One group was receiving the therapy. The second group was told, you know, write about your problems, right? Focus on your problems, write about the trouble. And the third group was told, don't do any of that. You know what you should do? Each week, you should write a letter of gratitude to someone. And what they found was that even if the people did not mail that letter of gratitude, the group that was asked to express gratitude performed incredibly better. I'm just trying to see if they have a stat or how they define it. They don't define it more than that, but they were in much better shape mental health wise than their peers who either ruminated over their problems instead of ruminating over the things that were still, despite that, going well, or the people who were receiving therapy alone, right? So, you know, the punchline there is, on the physical side, we have the Nun study. On the emotional and mental health, it's not so surprising to us. You know, studies are nice when they reinforce things that make sense anyway. Otherwise, we have to look even more deeply at them. And what we're saying is, hey, you know, if you live this way, this is good emotionally, psychologically, mentally as well. And I think the final point, which will be a springboard to get us back to Modeh, and I apologize, I don't see her now. Maybe she logged out. And oh, Linda had her hand raised. So when I finish this, Linda, if you still would like to say something. I'm sorry I didn't get to you yet. But from a spiritual perspective, it makes a lot of sense that the better we are, the more we're leading our lives in ways that resonate with God, that match those things God expects of us and would like of us, the more that God is likely to say, good job, and please God, stay around for longer. So from a spiritual perspective, this gives God an added incentive to say, you're doing well. The secret to longevity, physical, none study, emotional, Indiana University, and spiritual, lead good lives and please God, that's enough. And so let's go back to Moda Ani and discover one last insight before we move on from Moda Ani, and that is found in the very end. Eliezer, I thought you were going to ask about this, so I'm glad that you didn't, so we didn't jump ahead. But we have these two final words, possibly it was mistranslated here, so I removed them, right? We thank God, we acknowledge God, we admit that God's the one who's behind the scenes and doing these daily miracles. And how does it end? Rabbah emunatecha. Rabbah refers to multitudes, right? Like great, abundant. So great is your. And then emunatecha, we know the word emunah. The word emunah is faith. And so what exactly are we saying at the end of Moda Ani, this prayer of gratitude with which we begin our days? We're saying something great and something about faith. And the answer, some suggest, and my favorite suggestion by far, is Rabbah emunatecha is not about our faith in God, the faith that we are most used to thinking about, speaking about, but rather it is about God's faith in us. After all, sleep, according to the Talmud, is a form our souls depart, was even in the prayer. Sleep is a 60th of death. Every time we wake up in the morning, why are we grateful? We're grateful because we are still here, because God is here.
Your whole life.
And why is God leaving us here? And why is God doing this? And the answer is, it's a vote of confidence each and every day. So view emunatecha not as our faith in God, but as God's faith in us.
And everybody has different.
Tying it all together,
I
just want to ask if someone can mute whoever's
the negative and the positive.
It's the iPhone.
iPhone.
Yeah, they're able to live their life and.
Okay, I can't see who that is. I muted one, which will hopefully help. And thank you for calling out which it is. But it's God, faith in us. And right, so if we are tying it together, we are saying we have a beautiful tefillah with which we are familiar, which are the first words literally that are supposed to be out of our mouth every day. They are words of gratitude. Because they are words of gratitude, point number one, beautiful concept number one is don't start talking about yourself, right? Don't make a long preamble. I just want to tell everyone how grateful I am. It's not about you. Gratitude by definition, we're saying Modeh Ani, both here and as Eliezer pointed out elsewhere in Tefillah. We know that we are saying that gratitude has so many benefits, both from a health perspective, from a psychological perspective, and from a spiritual perspective. And for all of these reasons, when we start our day, then God is saying, you know what, vote of confidence. You started with gratitude, and I too have faith in you. This is part one. Part one of part one. If anyone has questions, Linda, I don't know if you still do, but please feel free to unmute.
I'm good. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, I had this thought for everyone. You could either unmute or just raise your hands and nod, those I see on screen. But is anyone familiar? I mentioned in the Indiana University study that there were letters that people wrote of gratitude, right? Saying thank you. There's a whole movement in both business and spirituality and self-help where people have gratitude journals. Are you familiar with the expression? Okay, so I sat back, and this isn't anything about me. As I said, the focus should not be on us, but I took a step back and I said, what if we view Tanakh, right, as a gratitude journal? not something that we are writing, but as something that in recording the stories of our avot and our imahot, right, of our forefathers and mothers, in recounting the very struggles and real emotions, in recounting both miracles and things either not so miraculous or miraculous in less positive directions, there's a lot of opportunity to review these stories and to explore the nuances. And so in the same way that we started with Moda Ani, the first words out of our mouth, what better place to start than Bereshit, both the book of Genesis, but also the parasha. And we're not going to go too far. We're just going to explore 3 or 4 small points that I think, my goal is twofold. Less so, but in part to say, oh my goodness, sometimes things are right there in the print and we don't even realize, right? You might just think like, oh, being nice, being grateful, that's cute, or that's so new agey. And then you open up Tanakh and you say, okay, you know what? It's pretty fundamental. It's pretty core. It's right here. And so, one part of doing this, I think, is just giving ourselves those reminders, looking and rediscovering the centrality. But even more interesting, I think, is looking at some of the nuances of these stories and seeing how those nuances could help us develop richer forms of gratitude and understand a nuanced view that will be even more helpful than just saying, be happy, be grateful, etc. Right? So let us dig in. And I think the first place to start is an obvious place, but it's with creation itself, right? So without even reading any sources, we're grateful that God, or I hope we are, obviously everyone's at a different point in their lives, but we are grateful that God created the world and us in the world. And so that's our starting point when we're thinking about Bereshit for gratitude. But when you look at the sources, I think it gets even more interesting.
No, I'm okay.
Without further ado, I'll just dig in. Michael, do you want to just read the first part? In the beginning, God created? You're still muted. You're still
Okay.
muted. Oh,
In
there
the
you
beginning, God created. This verse calls aloud for explanation in the manner that our rabbis explained it. God created the world for the sake of the Torah, which is called Reshait, Proverbs 8:22, the beginning of his way, and for the sake of Israel, who are called Bereshiti, the beginning.
It's okay. Yeah.
The beginning of his increase. Israel was holy to the Lord, the first fruits of his harvest.
Okay. So the very first, thank you so much, Michael. So the very first word of the Torah, which gives the name to the book, at least in Hebrew, is Bereshit, bet meaning in, and Reshit meaning something. And our rabbis are looking to unpack what this means. And there's one of the great expressions of Rashi, right? When you don't understand what it means, they use this phrase, the verse is like shouting, explain me, let me know what is going on here, people. We really care, we want to know. And so what Rashi does is Rashi gives 2 explanations of what this word is doing. It's some word that is tied to the word first, which is why it's so often translated beginning. And what Rashi is saying is it's not so much in the beginning, it's a for the sake of some word that means something like first or beginning. And what we are doing is the Torah in the very first word is providing the historical and theological explanation for why God created the world. And the answer is God created the world using 2 verses, either for the Torah, we'll skip and get back to it, or for us, right? For the Jews and more broadly for humanity. After all, we are Or Lagayim, a light unto the nation, etc. Not starting a whole other conversation. But what we have here is the very first word of the Torah as explained by Chazal, as explained by Rashi, that great granddaddy of commentators, right, is saying that the world was created, why? For us, for our benefit. And what I think that accomplishes when you think about gratitude overall, because again, I want to take these things as a jumping off point, is aspects of gratitude when you're thinking, not that we need to be stingy with gratitude. Gratitude, as we said, is good for us. But when you're thinking about what situations most call for gratitude, so I think this touches on one of those aspects. I wrote it, if you could see on the bottom of the screen, but intentionality, or as we talk about it in Hebrew, kavanah, right? We are here in this world, we're not an oopsie baby. And what that means more fundamentally, I like to think about food examples. My wife will be surprised, certainly since it's kitchen examples and I'm not very handy in the kitchen. But in this fanciful alternate universe, let's pretend that I am. And so let me give you the following example. I make a pasta dish for myself because I love pasta. I fully intend to eat everything. I somehow am less of a chazer pig than I normally am. And there are leftovers, and the leftovers are in the fridge. And my lovely wife comes home from work and healing the world, and she sees those leftovers and she eats those leftovers. I can't say that I deserve the most credit, right? I didn't prepare a meal for my wife. There was a meal left over. Less of a case for gratitude. One aspect that I think intuitively we think about that calls for gratitude is when you are consciously doing something nice for someone else. And the second aspect, touched on a little for someone else, but is that idea for our benefit, which could mean one of two things. I mean, it definitely means that it's not something that the person doesn't like, but then in the hierarchy, right, I could have intentionally baked a pasta dish. See, I don't even know the words. Made a pasta dish, whatever it is, right? I could have intentionally made enough pasta for two people knowing that my wife was coming home. That's scenario number one, and it fulfills intentionality. But maybe it's even better than that. Maybe I made a pasta dish with olives, even though, as she knows, I hate olives, because that really matters to her. So this notion of thinking about what really matters for the other person, I think, is also wrapped into what exhibits our thoughtfulness and what in turn might elicit more call for gratitude. And then the final piece that I think, at least it's not right there in the immediate text, but when we add some of Chazal's interpretation, there's one other idea that is wrapped into this story. And there is a concept, it's expressed in many midrashim, as well as commentaries. I just picked one as a random example. And this one, as a starting point, uses a word that's used that generally implies X, that there were things that might not have been great before. But the concept is that the world in which we live was not world number one. There were multiple other worlds before us that God created and then destroyed. They weren't good enough, right? God had many first batches of cake until ultimately he, she, God made the perfect cake. And this is not the first world. And what that means, just simply when we think more broadly, right? We're not God. And fortunately, I hope we have many reasons to thank God. But beyond the specifics of creation, I'm trying to highlight three aspects that help us build gratitude, both help us think more about behaving in such a way as to merit gratitude and for us to be more grateful people. Point number one, intentionality. Point number two, really thinking about what matters to the other person. And point number three, the amount of effort extended, right? Finding that kosher Pop-Tart in the microwave is not going to be quite as impressive as if I make my wife a 3-course meal. Again, apologies to my wife who might now think while preparing this class, I also somehow learned how to cook. Not yet the case. So the first, let me pause for a minute and see if anyone has any questions or thoughts that they want to add. the very silent Margie right now, but that's okay. I'm assuming you're just spelling.
Just absorbing, just absorbing.
Not a problem.
Are you gonna expand a little bit more about intentionality? Because it's kind of been my experience that without, being conscious about it and habitual about it, it doesn't happen.
So, it's a great point. I am and I am not in the following way. So I'm glad that you're bringing it up, Michael, right? So by definition, starting with, and it's only one example, I think we need to bake gratitude into our daily lives for it to happen. And Judaism does that in several ways. Some we'll talk about in this class, some in other classes. The first way is that famous prayer, but there are many other examples. The second way that I'm suggesting, which is this large catch-all, is to look at the Bible and look at individual stories, both to be reminded of the importance, right? We're definitely not going to practice something unless we're reminded that it is a value worth practicing. So let's read the Bible with that lens, and let's also pay attention to the nuances in several ways, as we'll see. And then finally, in future classes, there are some blessings that I think are 100% related to gratitude. There are others that I think are accomplishing slightly different things, but there are a whole host of ways that we have baked into Jewish customs, Jewish laws, where this is absolutely the goal, and that's part of what we're going to unpack. So thank you for giving me the chance to expound on that. I love it.
Thanks.
Okay. If no one else has anything to say at this point, let me just jump to the second. The second is both fanciful and I think true, and you'll tell me what you think. So there's a famous phrase from Bereshit. I'm calling it a chorus of ki tovs. Ki tov is the Hebrew for that it was good. And as we know throughout creation, God creates something, pauses, looks at it, and then says it was good. So we will just quickly read through a few of them, right? God says, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good. God separates the light from the darkness, day one, right? Vayomer Elokim yikavu hamayim mitachat hashamayim. Then we have the day and the land, and we have vegetation and seed bearing, and God again sees that it was good, and that's day 3. Then we have day 4 of the 2 great lights, which we'll get back to, the sun and the moon. We have day 5 with swarms of living creatures and birds and sea monsters, oh my, right? So we have all of these moments where God is seeing it. And in each case, there are 2 expressions that are playing a role. In Hebrew, vayar, seeing, and ki tov, I highlighted the word tov, the word good, right? God creates, God sees what's created and also sees that it is good, right? We have this as well on the 6th day. I summarized, and obviously we are part of the 6th day. So this hits home. We're going to get back to the phrase very good, but God is seeing and God is declaring things are good. And so I am going to open this to the crowd and then tell you what I think, but I had an idea. You'll tell me if I hit the mark or not. I had an idea that this could relate to gratitude in an interesting way. And I'd love to hear if anyone guesses along with me. So opening that up for a minute, and if not, you're stuck with my answer. Corinne, if that's how you pronounce it, did you have something to say?
Yeah. I have no questions.
Okay. Well,
I'm just listening and enjoying.
I'd love to be you and have no questions. I have many questions, but I'm glad there are no questions.
No, I'm just taking it all in.
Love it. So here was my thought. How does this relate to gratitude? And I'm going to briefly tell you a story, a different study, one we haven't mentioned so far, and it's inspired by a Reese's cup. This has added resonance for me because I love Reese's peanut butter cups, right? So this colleague of a psychologist at the University of Florida, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, put a Reese's in the refrigerator. And obviously, as we all know, a lot of time elapses, and ultimately she comes back. She comes back, and what does she see? She opens the refrigerator. Let's just assume, because of preservatives and other things, that these foods stay good for longer than maybe would otherwise be ideal. But she feels great, right? There is a surprise Reese's, and she turns to a psychologist, a colleague in the department, and she says, "Oh my goodness, my past self left my future self a Reese's." And this little anecdote inspired that professor and a student of his to do a study, and I think other people have done different versions of this study, but they did a study on what they call self-gratitude, right? And the importance of not only being grateful to other people, but of giving ourselves those occasional and necessary pats on the back. And so with that backdrop in mind, take it or leave it, and you could still love everything else in the class, I hope. I had the concept that God was not only assessing what God had done on each of these days, but maybe God was in fact assessing it and saying, good job. Thank you for sending me the Reese's. I am grateful that God did this, right? God could use the royal we really shouldn't, right? So I am grateful that I did that. And maybe that's one aspect of what's going on here. And if it's not going on here, it's still just a jumping off point where we could think about the idea of self-gratitude. And is this something that we have enough of in our lives? Is this something that we should encourage more of and look for? And I think in just completing that point of tying it fancifully or accurately to the text, what I could say is we have the phrase in Hebrew we have not used yet, which is hakarat hatov. The tov word should now be familiar, whatever your level of Hebrew, because tov means good. And hakarat, as we see in English, it means recognition. And we know in English and in Hebrew, you have the words for seeing and recognizing are intentionally, what would the formal phrase be? They're sisters of each other, and the same word can imply both. So when you say, I recognize Linda, now that I've seen her during this class, it means that I see Linda and I know who Linda is, whereas I might recognize a more subtle point about the parasha or about gratitude or whatever might mean something a little bit different. And so when God in each of these phrases is both seeing / recognizing and saying it's good, perhaps we have an acting out an expression of this phrase, self-gratitude. Anyway, so that is the Hakarat HaTov, and that's our second jumping off point. Again, within Tanakh, the first was thinking about creation, thinking about what God has done for us, and not only being grateful for that, but then taking the message of what is part and parcel of both doing things that might inspire gratitude, what is part and parcel of when we should be most inclined to give our gratitude. And for that, we had suggested that it's the other person's intention, the other person's really thinking about you and what is for your benefit, and the amount of effort expended. And in this case, the second point from Bereshit that we've been talking about is this idea that perhaps as God was not only expressing their pleasure at what had been created, but also saying, Yasher koach, God, good job. And so that's the second jumping point. Now, there's a fanciful story on one of the days that we talked about, which we're going to jump into right now. The question is grammatical, and that's what gets us to a really cool, fun point. Not grammar usually, right? But God creates what? God creates two great lights. In Hebrew, et shnei hameorot, the two lights, hagedolim. They are described as what? Big. That's what in Hebrew, big, great, etc. And then it says something which seems like they haven't been paying attention, right? It says, Et ha'ma'or hagadol mimshalat hayom. The sun is the big one for the day, and the smaller one is for the night, etc., etc. And so this is a jumping point for this great, beautiful image where it says that they were born what? If anyone wants to read either Corinne or Linda or Michael or anyone else. Okay, if someone could read the Rashi right here.
I'm looking. The Rashi? I can read the Rashi.
Yeah.
You want me to read? All right. The great luminaries, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, please.
Okay, the great luminaries, they were created of equal size, but that of the moon was diminished because she, using the word she there, complained and said, "It is impossible for two kings to make use of one crown." From Hulin.
Perfect. So are you familiar, not putting anyone on the spot, some of you may be familiar, some may not, with that idea, with that Gemara, but it's just this great image, right? And you could picture it, obviously, a parent with two kids fighting, and they say, I don't think we should each have the same toy. And they go, great point, the other one will have two toys and you'll have none, right? Hey, Moon, you complained. You are now diminished in size. You can't be equal. Great. You were hoping that you would be the boss. It's not going to work that way. So I love it. It's just this great moment that I think we could all relate to. But what's also really interesting is, of course, why is within this fanciful conceit, right? Why is the moon complaining? What word would we use in English? The moon is jealous, right? The moon is envious. And what's interesting, perhaps, and maybe this is obvious and more common, but you might have at least argued that jealousy finds expression most often when someone else has something you don't have, right? You're struggling to find a job and someone else has the best job in the universe, right? You're wondering where your next meal could come from when someone brags that they just came back from this amazing gourmet kosher restaurant. You're debating how to share a car and someone else says, I have a garage full of Jay Leno's cars, et cetera, right? We are used to envy in its most common form being what we will see later, even on the spiritual front, which is what? You have Cain and Hevel, and one of them, they don't seem equal or they're not treated equally, right? One succeeds and one fails. And Cain is going to be jealous of the fact that Cain's offering wasn't chosen. But I would argue it's not obvious that when people are at a similar station, that also can occasionally lead to jealousy. And it does. And it's a good reminder. And, the children example may have said that this is less convoluted than Ari is making this out to be. But here's what I really love in terms of everything we are talking about tonight, right? What I love is that this is starting to get into realness and into human emotions and into human psychology. And it's also starting to get to, in the same way Michael was raising, okay, let's say we all agree that we should be grateful. How do we get there? How do we keep up the intention, et cetera? Here, I think this is one, and we're going to touch on others in different classes, but this is one example of something that can block gratitude. There's a great expression, doesn't use the word gratitude, but it leads to the same point. My wife loves to quote it, and it says, comparison is the thief of joy, right? Envy stops us from being joyful. Envy also stops us from being grateful. And what's fascinating is that it works in both directions, in that if you are envious, it is going to be hard for you to be grateful. And conversely, the more you cultivate, as they say, an attitude of gratitude, the more you'll find that envy just has less of a place in your life. And so here, the first quote is a summary Rabbi Sachs shared from some research, and as part of what he was describing was that gratitude enhances self-respect. I'll just read that, making it less likely that you'll envy others for their achievement or success. I think it's so key, it's so logical, but I wanted to share a few different ways that people touch on these points. And so the second example is from a study on gratitude. Researchers found, and you're seeing my screen, right? Grateful people report themselves as being less materialistic, but also for our purposes, less envious. And one of the things that I love is here, I'm just going to highlight it for a second with my mouse, right? I love that this gets into a really cool, I was going to say philosophical, psychological, so help me out with the words, but a really cool point, which is that gratitude is really also connected to being in the moment and in the experience. And envy is stopping us from the ability to be present, and it's hoisting us into the future, right? Because what I'm really thinking about is not what I have now, but wow, wouldn't it be great if I had what she had, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things they point out, the interspersed, by the way, there's an article called Gratitude as an Antidote to Envy, appropriately enough. And so he intersperses lines in the study, and I show those in italics with his summary points I show in non-italics. If someone could just...
Corinne, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Okay, so what I love also is just this idea that because they're coming from an opposite place, he says, if you're doing one thing, including if you're being grateful, then you're going to find it hard to have time for anything else, right? It may be difficult. Sorry, I highlighted the wrong one. You can't be grateful and envious at the same time, right? So part of what he's getting at is be grateful, and then it's going to be a lot harder for you to be envious. But you could tackle any part of this. I mean, I think by uncovering, by reminding us of the link between gratitude and envy, then we're doing a few things. We're saying, hey, if we want to be grateful people, even if it's not automatic, let's think about the ways and the whys of our envy. And possibly it could be, I'd love it's the case, as easy as saying, while we're being grateful, you do this, you get added benefits, right? Quit smoking, you were quitting for this reason, and now you have this added benefit that you didn't even think about. But here is the last, this wasn't about gratitude. I mean, it was about gratitude, but not about envy per se. But I think this ties into the idea we had that you can't feel two things at the same time, especially the more opposite they are. And it's a beautiful quote from Lily Tomlin, right? She was dying of cancer, sadly. She remained very positive, and she said, this was paraphrased, the mind, while capable of many thoughts per second, is only capable of one at a time. Thus, if I choose to think of something positive, by default, I can't be thinking of something negative at that moment. And when you string together many positive thoughts throughout your day, it will be a good day. Right? She didn't say this. We could say it will be a Moda'ani day. So I already did some of the summaries, but bear with me. I think it's helpful to summarize. There's a lot of great information as well as comments that you shared with us. So what we're really doing is, if we take it from the top, we're saying part of our recognizing and part of our inculcating this attitude of gratitude that we know matters is number one with how we start our day. And we start our day with an expression of gratitude. And when we dig deeper, we realize we're not only saying the words Ani Modeh, but we are instead saying Modeh Ani. We're taking pains to not make it about us, to be other directed. And that's one aspect of appreciation. And we know that this is a prayer that we say when we wake up, and literally when we're thanking God for life. And we know that gratitude is part of the key for that, right? It's not just a coincidence that it's the first thing we say. It's also the recipe for how we continue to wake up, please God, tomorrow and the next day for many, many years to come. And we've seen in studies, not we personally, right? But we reflected and shared some of the studies that showed that gratitude could help us physically and emotionally and spiritually, could give God a reason to be appreciative of everything we do, which all culminates in God saying, Rabbah emunatecha, I have faith in you, I believe in you, and that's why you're here. And that finds expression not only in our identification, for those of us who are Jewish or Jew-friendly, right? Jews are a people named after Judah, and Judah is still around because of living up to these traits and attributes. And then what we said is, hey, I know this idea of writing a gratitude journal, and we are all for that. but let's look not only at what we could write, right? For the same reason we study history, there's a lot that's already there before us. Let's look at the Bible through this lens, and the three stories that we shared and the three ideas that we shared were, number one, gratitude for God creating the world and creating us, and recognizing a lot of the depth that I won't repeat to what made that even more special, and how we could have a more layered expression of not only when we give gratitude, but of doing the type of acts that elicit and are worthy of getting gratitude in return. That was the first idea. The second idea was the suggestion that when God gives his, her, their proverbial stamp of approval and says Vayar and Kitov and seeing and good, seeing is also recognizing good, and self-gratitude is important too. And if it's important for God, it's certainly being spelled out only because it's more important for us, right? We're humans, we need it. We should take time not only for self-care, but for self-gratitude. Thank ourselves for the Reese's we squirreled away. Just make sure to get rid of it before Pesach. Okay, and finally, we could think about the sun and the moon and different types of envy and jealousy, and how they could rear their ugly heads even among equals, not only among people who are better off than ours. And how do we deal with that? And we deal with it directly or indirectly, but recognize the connection. If we're trying to be more grateful people, part of that is making sure at the same time that we're less envious people. And Rabbi Lily Tomlin, right? She told us, hey, if you could only think of one thing at a time and you choose to be positive, just keep doing that and you will push out the envy and bring in more gratitude. So I think that's a pretty appropriate place to end in addition to the time. But if anyone has any final questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear it in the little bit of time we have left.
I put mine in the chat.
Oh, okay. Thank you for telling me, and I missed it. I do try to do that.
Ari, I have to go and start another meeting, but I want to thank you for this session. It was very informative. And I posted a quote from a famous rabbi in the chat for anybody
Perfect.
who wants to look at that.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. And yeah, Linda, certainly outside my expertise, I would here's what I would say. I imagine I am a fan of religious people throughout the world. Certainly there are some differences. This is pretty key and core. And I think where you really might find differences are when we dig further in terms of things built into our religion, not saying there aren't analogs in other religion, right? But if we say, okay, Moda'ani, so another religion may not have Moda'ani, but they may have something else, right? So what are some of the practical and, well, I'm not going to say an impractical, but what are some of the ways that we seek to cultivate this? What are interesting dimensions of a Jewish holiday, of Jewish blessings, of Jewish experience? And that's where I imagine you're going to see more differences. And that's where, if we would invite, the imam or the priest, they could share things that we're unaware of from their religion, where they do the same, again, stepping outside just the Bible on some of the examples. But great question and point. So the last thing that I'll say, and again, if anyone feel free to chat and point out to me that it's in the chat so I don't miss it. Thank you, Linda. But just to give you a sense of what we're going to do next week we're still going to be going through things in Tanakh itself, right? Different stories and different, I think, nuances, because the goal is not just let me give you 30 examples of the same thing, but as I think we did tonight, finding nuance and meaning based on the various stories. And then certainly as part of the third session, if not the fourth, we'll look at some of those practices and say, brachot, blessings, is it all blessings? Is it some type of blessings? How do we understand blessings? And look as well at activities, at halachot, at things like a Sudat Mitzvah, right? Like a meal of gratitude, of course, is related. And I think then that will help put everything together and also give us a sense of how we could really be truly more grateful people, which is more living up to whom we would want to be and echoing, at least according to one of my explanations, how God presents, if that's part of God's ketov. So I thank everyone. I'll wait on for another minute or two if anyone else has a last minute thought or, oh, I meant to say this, but it's great. I love seeing you all. Barbara, Eliezer, Chelsea, thank you, Alethea. I'll get in trouble because I won't go down. Obviously, my parents, Cheryl, my in-laws, Barry, Judy, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been really great studying with you and thinking in, I hope, a meaningful and inspiring way about something that's very central, but also because of its depth, something that I think we could always learn and explore at greater length and with greater meaning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Great topic.
Okay, thanks.